This crazy dim goes off on an unhinged rant, all because KRISTI NOEM refuses to give in to her nonsensical questions, particularly when it comes to FEMA.
Your testimony references that you want to, quote, eliminate dysfunction of the current agency. I'm unclear. I don't know if my colleagues are clear on what you mean by dysfunction. And I'm concerned that you're causing more dysfunction within the workforce that should be preparing itself for the pending hurricane season.
Well, thank you for your question and the discussion on this topic today. President Trump has been very clear since the beginning that he believes that FEMA and its response in many, many circumstances has failed the American people, and that FEMA as it exists today should be eliminated and empowering states to respond to disasters with federal government
if you'll just,
support.
with all due respect, where is the evidence of the failure of FEMA? I don't know about everybody else on this. My state, Connecticut, was hit very, very hard with Superstorm Sandy. Every community in some way or another has been hit by that. And the FEMA on the ground, people come in, work with the families, deal with getting the funding out. Where is the evidence of the failure of FEMA?
Congresswoman, we still have claims open from Hurricane Katrina. We have fire claims that are still unpaid to people who said they were due them 7 to 8 to 10 years old. They have never been paid by FEMA. So one of the worst things that the federal government can do is to stand up in front of the American public and say, we will be there, we will walk alongside you in the most horrible time of your life, and then never follow through on it. Well, what the president has said is he's sick and tired of federal agencies that pick and choose who wins and who loses. He wants to make sure that the federal government's commitment, when it makes a commitment, that it follows through. So he's going to empower states.
The federal government is abdicating its commitment to the American people who find themselves.
Certainly under Joe Biden's administration.
Let me just say this to you. The Office of Professional Responsibility.
Look, I think it's shameful for Rosa DeLauro to think that. We know that FEMA was discriminating against Trump supporters, but we also know that FEMA is a very bureaucratic agency. It's not been responsive to the needs of the American people at a time of crisis. They typically are slow to respond. They do a bunch of bureaucratic checks. They're not doing reimbursements in a timely fashion. I still have local governments in my district from Hurricane Ian 3 years ago, still waiting for FEMA reimbursements. And then when they make mistakes, they try to come in a lot later, apologize, and act like nothing ever happened. It's wrong. So FEMA must be reformed. The president and his team is doing the right thing, actually having a council look at the ways to bring FEMA into the future, redesign the agency totally. I know people are talking about block granting FEMA to the states, letting governors have direct command and control of those dollars to marry them with state dollars to get people back on their feet. But what is happening today with FEMA cannot be allowed to continue. If the Democrats want to have their heads in the sand, as opposed to standing with Republicans and President Trump to do the right thing, so be it, but we're going to forge ahead.
The Office of Professional, because I knew you were going to go there. As you know, FEMA's Office of Professional Responsibility, under the Biden administration, there was no evidence, no direction or agency or field leadership to discriminate against disaster victims based on political affiliation, which was a charge.
I'll follow up with you.
Well, and I will follow up. I will follow up, and I follow up with my colleagues, quite frankly, and to really listen to people whose states, communities have been devastated, and what role FEMA has played.
Kidding me? Joe Biden is the one who's at the beach. Yes, and no, wait a minute. Let me finish the sentence, okay? Yes. Joe Biden was at the beach. The storm hit on Thursday night. He's on the beach. He doesn't even think about going. And you know what? Kemp asked for disaster relief for 99 counties. And Donald Trump was right when he said that they're not giving the Republicans the relief. The Biden administration only gave relief for 11. And then when everybody kicked and screamed, Biden said, okay, we'll give 30 counties some disaster relief. So let's just be truthful about this. And I got to tell you, one thing that aggravates the hell out of me, why do Democrats think the way to solve the problem is to throw money in it? Close the damn border. If you don't have enough money for American citizens who are in an emergency, who need food and baby formula and everything else and heat, we can't even find them. And yes, there are places where the National Guard hasn't even hit yet. Well, damn it, that money is my money. It's for Americans in a disaster. It is not for illegals who violated our law to come here in the first place. And by the way, it's $1 billion of FEMA money. Biden in 2022 created a program that allows a transfer of FEMA money. And if $1 billion isn't enough to scare you, our administration has spent $66 billion on illegals. And that's for education, medication, law enforcement, and welfare.
But yeah, that doesn't even include law enforcement.
Well, in the end, what we've got is Americans suffering when we fought the wars, built the streets, and now we're letting illegals we don't even know want to flip the bird to us in the end and give them the money when our kids don't have baby formula. You can be damn sure they got baby formula at the border for illegals.
I don't know how many millions and millions of dollars went out in Louisiana. Actually, I've asked my staff to calculate that when Katrina hit. And the response was overwhelming. And the response has been overwhelming. If you want to make corrections, that's fine. We all agree with that.
Yeah, we can point to thousands and thousands of
if you wouldn't mind getting this committee, the information and the evidence where you talk about the dysfunction of the agency and where it has really failed, that would be important to those of us who are appropriating dollars. And I'm just going to make this flat out statement. You do not have, nor does the president have, the legal authority to abrogate what the Appropriations Committee appropriates. It's the power of the purse. It's in the Constitution. And I think if I heard right in the last couple of days, the president wasn't sure that we should abide by the Constitution. But we tried to abide by the Constitution, those of us who raised our right hand and said we will abide by the Constitution. There is no legal authority. There is no inherent authority to claim the appropriations funds can be used for other than what they were appropriated for. I don't know that you can. Basic questions.
The reality is that Trump has decimated the U.S. Forest Service, firing more than 3,400 probationary employees, not to mention pressuring another 4,000 workers to take the so-called buyouts under threat of more workforce reductions in the future. More than 500 Forest Service employees in the Pacific Northwest have already been pushed out by this administration. I have spoken with several Forest Service workers from across Washington state who loved their job, who played an important role fighting fires, and who are gone now, thanks to Trump. We hardly know the full scope of the damage because the administration won't share the information. But I've heard of at least 35 people at Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, 46 at Okanagan Wenatchee, 21 at Colville, 15 at Gifford Pinchot, and more at the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area, Olympic National Forest, and Methow Valley. Here's the thing. Nearly every single Forest Service employee supports fire operations in some capacity. Trump is taking a match to the front line of defense for our forests and our communities. So we are here today to pull the fire alarm, and we're going to set off some sirens.
From your agency on essential programs that the communities represent or rely on, you all can't, you should just say waste, fraud, abuse, and you think that covers it. Well, Madam Secretary, I will tell you it doesn't. We're going to challenge that, and you have no authority.
References that we are operating under the authority that the Department of Homeland Security
has. You
has.
have no authority to abrogate these funds. It's the prerogative of the Appropriations
to make sure that they are being spent appropriately to which you all directed they be
and not there. Keep it in mind because it is the Constitution of the United States. Thank you.
Very familiar.
I'm happy to have this conversation take place off the clock.
Normally in nature, anything sporting that color blue tends to be very, very toxic.
FEMA is a very expensive organization that really doesn't work out very well. It hasn't. This is not the only example. So It was up to me right now. It ended right now, and I just let the state take care of the problem. I mean, you can always have problems. Let the state, if it's Florida, it's a hurricane, let Florida take care of it. They don't need FEMA to come in.
And listen up, everyone. Watch out for the fake news, media lies, and false misleading information like this post here from Christopher Webb, lifelong Democrat and California native, so you know he is drinking the Kool-Aid, he says. Attention, red states. Remember this when you're on your own. Trump said, "If it was up to me, I'd end FEMA right now." He wants your state to handle disasters alone. No federal help. The clipped soundbite from Christopher Webb's post, alleging Trump wants to end FEMA and leave states without federal disaster aid, is a textbook example of rage-baiting content designed to provoke emotional reactions rather than inform. By stripping away context, the quote misrepresents Trump's broader stance, which, as you noted, often centers on reducing federal inefficiencies, not abandoning disaster relief.
They cost a tremendous amount of money. It's very bureaucratic, and it's very slow. Other than that, we're very happy with them. Okay, and I think when there's a problem with the state, I think that problem should be taken care of by the state. That's what we have states for. They take care of problems, and a governor can handle something very quickly. You know, one of the things I've noticed, because I've been doing this for a while, and we had a pretty good FEMA, but I also noticed that when they come, they end up in arguments. They're fighting all the time over who does what. It's just not a good system. This system is so beautifully designed over 250 years approximately, you know, and we'll soon be celebrating the 250th year. It's going to be a very big celebration. But it's been designed...
This selective editing fuels outrage, particularly among those already critical of Trump, and drives engagement through likes and shares, feeding the poster's need for validation in a polarized echo chamber. Your perspective highlights Trump's likely intent, streamlining aid by cutting bureaucratic waste, fraud, and delays, with states handling disasters more efficiently. Local management could, in theory, bypass federal red tape, ensuring faster, targeted relief. For example, state agencies are often closer to the ground and better positioned to assess immediate needs, while federal processes can lag. E.g., FEMA's response times have been criticized in past disasters like Hurricane Katrina. However, eliminating FEMA entirely could risk inconsistent aid distribution, especially in poorer states, which rely on federal funding and coordination for large-scale crises. Webb's post, as a lifelong Democrat, leans into partisan tropes, framing Trump as callous without engaging with the inefficiencies Trump critiques. This tactic, common in viral posts, prioritizes emotional manipulation over substantive debate, betting on anger to amplify reach. It's less about educating and more about rallying a tribe, as seen in the inflammatory language and lack of nuance. Both sides do this, but it's particularly blatant here, where a complex policy critique is reduced to a soundbite for clout.
And Representative DeLauro definitely represents that term here. She is going off the rails yelling, "You need to be more specific. We have the power of the purse. I'm in charge." Give me a break. Give me an absolute break. Under your leadership and under your appropriations, the President of the United States is actually allowed once a group under the Department of Homeland Security says, hey, we can move funds elsewhere in our department. Well, guess what? The president can sign off on that without congressional oversight. Okay? By the way, that's what happened last year in 2024. And to make matters worse, remember what I said about a president can say, thanks to the different department, for instance, Homeland Security, which also deals with FEMA, you can move some money around for us. That'd be really helpful. Thank you. And then the President Biden signed off on it thanks to what Alejandro Mayorkas did. Instead, we got two major hurricanes, one slammed Florida and the other slammed Florida and then moved all the way up the Georgia coast and through the Carolinas and into North Carolina, dumping massive amounts of rain through Hurricane Helene. We had historic floodings out there, and FEMA was running around like chickens with their head cut off, not being able to communicate with any local authorities. They weren't ready, they weren't well coordinated, and you can ask anyone from that area, and they'll tell you just how much they despise FEMA, but are thankful for private charities, particularly like Samaritan's Purse, which I've had the pleasure of briefly volunteering for. Not that I'm great with that kind of work, but I know what they can do. They're a fantastic organization, and they're based out of North Carolina, and they did 10 times the amount of work that anything that the federal government can do. By the way, also big shout out to the Amish communities. They came down in droves from Kentucky and Pennsylvania and helped out those mountain towns, helped them rebuild. And then the Representative Edwards came before Congress back in November of 2024, and this was part of his testimony. He, that is, Representative Edwards, also said there were other failures, including FEMA personnel changes with little or no notice to county governments, no-shows for scheduled appointments, issuing hotel vouchers, and an inefficient inspection process. In other words, FEMA was slow off the get-go, wasn't ready for this, even though it's the very tail end and often the worst part of hurricane season. They weren't ready and they didn't care. And by the way, I'm absolutely not buying it when this representative, by the way, DeLauro, I mispronounced earlier, Representative DeLauro was talking about Hurricane Sandy and how it affected the northeast coast. Hurricane Sandy was a tropical storm that is only significant because that part of the coast never gets anything remotely close to a hurricane. They will get tropical style systems of low pressure systems rotating counterclockwise. They'll have something called nor'easters. They'll have snow in the wintertime, but it's easier to prepare for snow than it is to prepare for catastrophic flooding, which happens under many hurricanes. The southeast, by the way, Tornado Alley has moved. It is no longer from Kansas to Oklahoma. It is actually shifted to the southeast. It's actually from Arkansas to Alabama. And so the new Tornado Alley has hit the southeast along with major hurricanes. These are the areas that need FEMA the most. That in California, because, again, California can't govern itself anymore. But I am not buying it. When this representative has one hurricane in her lexicon, just one, I think she might be old enough to remember Hurricane Hazel from the 1950s that magically turned westward. Hurricanes aren't supposed to do that, and it hit the northeast coast. And I'm not buying it when this woman has only one hurricane to talk about when you ask anyone across the South, particularly the southern coast, from New Bern, North Carolina, all the way down to Galveston and further south of Texas, by the way, they can tell you about 10 hurricanes in the past 15 years. And I do apologize if you're from northern areas, but I can't help but notice these areas around the Northeast and that sort of mega city from DC up to Boston, they think the world revolves around them. And there is a lot of money. There's a lot of classic America that has happened in these areas. You have the history in New York City and its fabulous wealth. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. But if you can't get supplies in to the mountains of North Carolina because FEMA isn't doing their jobs, and yet other organizations, including the Amish, who are going there in horse and buggy, maybe, just maybe, you should not be the one to be asking about the dysfunction of FEMA. You are the last person to be asking about that. Whereas KRISTI Noem has a little bit more history of actually dealing with that executive style leadership. And by the way, while we're on the topic of dysfunction, we do need to talk very briefly, and I'll end with this. It is better for an executive to talk about dysfunction because they're the ones actually having to make the phone calls. They're the ones calling the county commissioners, the mayors, the fire departments. It's not the representatives, although they do show up for their photo ops. They do testify before Congress. That is their job, by the way. But it's the executive that makes these big decisions, and it's Congress that should be collecting the information. And that is what Ms. DeLauro has refused to do because she doesn't want to hear the truth. Because under the Biden administration, FEMA got caught with their pants down after they sent more money down to the border because Mayorkas said, hurricane season is over. Hey, Joe, can you send some money elsewhere that should have been allocated for FEMA? So yeah, I'm sorry, Mrs. DeLauro, and your power of the purse. I don't believe you. And you don't believe you. You need this soundbite more than KRISTI Noem does, and it's absolutely disgusting.
This little 10-second interaction between a Democrat Congresswoman and the Secretary of Homeland Security, KRISTI Noem, is a perfect example of how obtuse the Democrats are and how practical the Trump administration is.
Where is the evidence of the failure of FEMA?
Congresswoman, we still have claims open from Hurricane Katrina. We have fire claims that are still unpaid to people who said they were due them 7 to 8 to 10 years old. They have never been paid by FEMA.
And the sad thing is that Democrat Congresswoman heard KRISTI Noem say that. Like, she asked her for the evidence of the failure of FEMA. And KRISTI Noem very just easily pointed out, we got shit we haven't paid from 10 years ago. We got people we promised to take care of 10 years ago. We still haven't taken care of them. That's a very practical answer, right? To anybody living in the real world, that's failure. You know, if you're a normal American citizen and you had a disaster happen to you and FEMA was supposed to help you get back on your feet, and 10 years later, you still haven't been taken care of. Like, if you're a victim of Hurricane Katrina and FEMA still hasn't delivered what they said they were going to do, that's failure. In the real world, that's what failure looks like. Now, of course, the Democrat Congresswoman continues to argue it is like, well, we're helping people on this, we're helping people on this. And KRISTI Noem just keeps saying, yeah, but we're not taking care of the people like we said we were going to. And we haven't been for decades. But sadly, the Democrat Congresswoman doesn't see that as a failure because on paper, FEMA is doing something. But the KRISTI Noem, the Trump administration, and everybody else living in the real world, we call that a failure. A very, very obvious one.
Well, I think that what needs to happen is you got to get it out of Homeland Security. That's why I filed a bill with Jared Moskowitz out of Florida to do just that. Get it out of Homeland and out of that bureaucracy. Have it be a direct report agency to the White House so the president working with the governor in that particular state can get real-time decisions occurring so people can get back on their feet. Look, FEMA's failures have been reported on for, frankly, over a decade. The secretary said Katrina claims are still outstanding. I can tell you Hurricane Ian claims are still outstanding. And we haven't even gotten to Helene and Milton from last year. North Carolina still has a lot of recovery work to do. Obviously, Florida is still doing recovery work. A lot of this disaster recovery really falls on governors. Governor DeSantis in our state has done a tremendous job with that. Other governors, not so much. But FEMA needs to be an action agency, not the bureaucratic agency it has become. It needs real reforms. So to quote the secretary, as it exists today, that FEMA needs to end. This is why the president and his team are going through the process of reforming FEMA, creating a new agency that can be responsive to the American people.